everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Has SDN Lived Up to the Hype? Sponsored by ECI, featuring participants from LinkedIn, Ashton Metzler and Associates, Level 3 Communications, and Orange Business Services. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, we'll ask for your feedback. The survey will pop open on your screen and will only take a second to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I'd now like to turn the event over to Light Reading CEO and founder, Steve Saunders. Steve?
Thanks, Julie, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today for today's event. It really is a great time to be talking about SDN, isn't it? Like its cousin, NFV, it's been on the receiving end of some really pretty incredible levels of industry hyperbole over the last few years. But now service providers have started installing it on production networks. And thus, it is time to ask the question, has SDN lived up to the hype? Well, with ECI's help today, we've put together a pretty extraordinary panel for today's webinar to discuss these points. Let's meet them now. From LinkedIn, we have Russ White, Network Architect. Good morning, Russ.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here. We also have Dr. Jim Metzler, Founder and Vice President of Ashton Metzler and Associates. You know, Jim really is an expert witness for us today. He's been an app developer. He's run the networks for not one but two Fortune 500 companies. He's also run a consulting firm. Very nice to have you with us today, Jim.
Steve, I'm really thrilled to be here.
Thank you. From ECI, ECI is a long-term partner and collaborator with Light Reading and really an acknowledged leader in virtualization, doing some fantastic and innovative work with virtualization. We have Chaim Porat, the CTO of ECI. Hi, Chaim. Welcome.
Hi, Steve. Happy to be with you.
Thank you. And then we're also honored to have two of our favorite CSPs or communication service providers, both of which are real pioneers in deploying virtualized services. From Level 3 Communications, first of all, we have Adam Sanger, Vice President, Global Product Development and Management. Hi, Adam.
Good morning, Steve.
Welcome. And finally, last but not least, we have Jacques Tardieu, Head of International Marketing Connectivity Business Unit from Orange Business Services. Welcome, Jacques.
Thanks, Steve. Nice to be here.
So, today's event is going to be exciting and extemporaneous. We are not going to have any presentations, you'll be glad to hear. Rather, we are going to work together with you, our audience, to create a free-flowing discussion designed to answer the following questions. Where is SDN being deployed? How is SDN being deployed? Why is SDN being deployed? And above all, what has the result been? So let's get started. First today, we're going to start with a polling question where we'd like you guys at home and at work to sit forward and get involved in our event today by answering the following question. Where is your company on the journey to rolling out SDN? So those are the potential answers. Please click one now. We'll give you a couple of seconds, and then I'm going to invite Chaim at ECI to give his reaction to the response from our audience. Okay, I think we're going to have a look at the results now. Great. Well, quite a spread of responses here. Obviously, very few people are not interested in implementing SDN. at any level, and actually a very large number of people here, almost a quarter, are actually rolling out SDN solutions. Chaim, what do you think of these results here? Are these pretty much in line with your expectation? Chaim, you may be on mute.
Yes, sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. So I'm saying that in general, it shows and reflects what we see in the market today. So nobody ignores SDN. Everybody wants to research it at the different levels. And since it's a new technology, we see a large spread of interest from people just looking at it to other people that are actively searching and trying to deploy solutions.
Mm. I think there is a huge amount of interest, isn't there? And I think that's borne out by our audience today. We have about 220 live attendees on this webinar, which I can tell you is an absolutely huge number in terms of the live attendance for these events. We have an awful lot of ground to cover today, so we're now going to move directly to our first panel question. Which is as follows. When we talk about SDN, there are two areas where SDN is prevalent, the data center and the WAN, or wide area network. And it's difficult to talk about where SDN is without making that distinction. Jim Metzler, can you elaborate on that for our listeners a little bit?
Yes, Steve, thanks so much. There are obviously a lot of similarities between applying SDN in the data center and SDN in the WAN, but there are also some real differences. And Steve, one of them is maturity, at least maturity of the conversation, if not the solution. And Steve, you alluded to it. We've been talking about SDN for 4 or 5 years now. Now, in the old days, 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't say SDN in the data center. That was implicit. That was the only application we really talked about of SDN, even though there are multiple use cases, such as deploying the dynamic movement of virtual machines or making configuration and provisioning easier. About the last 18 months, we've been talking about taking SDN principles and applying it into the WAN, and that's often referred to as an SD-WAN or software-defined WAN. Now, that term is a bit confusing to me, Steve, because that typically refers to a use case that features dynamic load balancing over multiple WAN links, and that's an important use case, but to me, that's just one use case of applying SDN in the WAN. So that's certainly one difference, the maturity of, again, the conversation and even the terminology. When I think of vendors, there are certainly some vendors in both camps that provide SDN solutions in the data center and in the WAN, but there are others that are in just one camp. And I know we're going to get to inhibitors and drivers soon, but if you just think about the fundamental design goals for the data center and the WAN, they're just terribly different. We design data center LANs around blazing speed, gig, 10 gig, 40 gig, faster, 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 and seldom, if ever, worry about latency. The WAN is entirely the opposite. We design it around reducing cost and reducing latency, and so the SDN solutions in those domains need to reflect that. So again, Steve, some similarities, but real differences.
Well, really, it sounds like we need two different flavors of the technology to meet those demands. Let me ask Chaim briefly, Chaim. ECI is supporting both iterations of SDN, both for SD-WAN and in the data center. Is it? Do you have to deploy very different types of approach there for those different domains?
Yes, I think what Jim has mentioned is very important because the data center is characterized by very dynamic, very fast and short distances that enable you to do very active and reactive control, while in the WAN, because of the structure, because of the long latencies and the big distances, you need to have another flavor of control, which is slower control loops and more emphasis on optimization rather on quick creation of connections.
Very interesting, very interesting. Let's move on to our next question. I mean, Jim, you referenced this before. What are some of the drivers and inhibitors of SDN today? And I'm going to pull in Adam at level 3. I mean, level 3 really has been doing such incredible innovative work on the services side with all flavors of virtualization, actually. Adam, would you like to tell us what are your thoughts on drivers and inhibitors of SDN right now?
Absolutely. We actually see two key drivers of SDN, and it's really important that any deployment of SDN contemplates both. Oftentimes, and to date, many of the deployments have factored one or the other, and those two things are both operational and customer use cases. Commonly, the deployment of SDN is looked strictly as a way to get more efficient or effective in the day-to-day operations. That can be applied both by the service provider, but also in the customer use cases as well, as they look to more tightly align both their network and IT assets or resources. From an inhibitor standpoint, it's critical for the service provider and the customer to take into consideration the mix of technologies. And it's both the mix of technologies, access types, the use cases. From a service provider perspective, it's critical to understand the tight integration of how SDN interacts both with front office and back office systems, but also, and what we'll talk about here in a little bit, is the human side to the deployment of SDN.
Very good. Jim, let's call Jim Metzler. Let's ask you for your thoughts on this one as well. Go ahead.
Well, I certainly agree that making things easier is a major driver of SDN in the data center, branch, campus, or WAN. But obviously, when you think about drivers, in the data center, I alluded to it, supporting the dynamic movement of virtual machines is an important driver in the data center. It's nowhere near as important in the WAN today. It may become that, but it's not. On the other hand, reducing cost in the WAN is always a driver, and so I alluded to a particular use case of SDN in the WAN. And so a driver that we don't see in the data center, reducing OpEx, really bubbles up to the top, in the wide area network. In terms of inhibitors, it shouldn't be terribly surprising that maturity tends to be an inhibitor. That's true with any new technology, any new way of doing things. What does surprise me, though, Steve, was when I do some market research and work with customers, they often allude to the fact they don't really have their heads around how to develop a business case. I hear that more in the WAN, which surprises me, but I hear it a bit in the data center. So, people are kind of struggling with how they develop a hardcore business case to justify the investments.
Well, that's obvious. I'm sure you're getting a lot of people asking you to help them with that, right?
That is true, Steve.
Yeah. Hiam, any thoughts here? Opportunity and hurdles?
Yes, I think I would like to refer to the drivers and inhibitors coming from the technology side. And I think from the beginning, the drivers for SDN were the openness, dynamic, and programmatic interfaces, which means that at the beginning, people wanted SDN, first and foremost, to be ability to have real vendor-agnostic solutions and cross-vendor solutions, and to have real-time control over the networks, being the dynamic SDN, and also have programmatic interfaces to the network so they can actually change the behavior of the networks according to their needs. What we see, in our opinion, is that at this juncture, SDN misses the mark on all three. Basically, the drivers that had been there from the beginning are not addressed, and basically the use cases are for simpler operations, like better management. And I think the inhibitors that prevented SDN to be there are vendor resistance, because SDN, basically, when you do vendor-agnostic solutions, you expect legacy vendors to resist that. We also see that the carriers are hesitant in requesting such solutions, meaning that if there was more demand for vendor-agnostic, programmatic, and dynamic solutions, either legacy vendors or startups would have created these solutions. And I also think that the lack of equipment there, which exists on the data center side but less on the telecom side, also prevents it from being deployed in mass. So I think in order for SDN to succeed, it's a joint work for carriers to push, vendors to seed, and everyone needs to work together in order to make it happen as it should have been.
Right, sort of as an ecosystem. I think that's exactly right. We've heard from our panelists about what some of the opportunities and inhibitors are. Let's ask you, our audience. It's time for another poll. Here's our next one. SDN has not yet been widely deployed by the majority of service providers. in your opinion, our audience, in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges impeding this deployment? Things like premature technology, cost savings are, up in the air, revenue generation on the flip side of that coin, is it that those aren't clear? Is it the integration with legacy equipment, organizational skill sets, or something else? Tell us now. Okay, let's look at those answers. Well, this is really interesting, I think, isn't it? We've got 32% of the audience saying it is this coexistence with legacy equipment, and the migration from the legacy is something which they really need help with. But also, some significant responses on the organizational skill set required to do this, and questions about how mature the technology is. Less concerns here about cost saving, and very few concerns about revenue generation at all, which I think is fascinating. And we've now got about 250 people live on this event, so we're really talking about a significant and extremely qualified audience survey here. Chaim from ECI, what do you think of these results? Any thoughts about this?
Yes, I think it's a nice development of the market. I mean, when we looked at it in the past, SDN was supposed to do cost saving and revenue generation. And I think from this poll, we understand that people have matured to understand that SDN will not do cost saving on the CapEx. And the revenue generation will come from use cases. And it's more about how we deploy the SDN in our solutions. I mean, I think people understand that they need to deploy SDN. They have the understanding that it's going to be some kind of a disruptive technology, which of course will require organizational skills and require a migration plan from where they are today.
Very good. You know what, I'm going to bring in Russ White right now from LinkedIn, because we haven't heard from you yet, Russ. Obviously, you're running a incredibly important and significant network over there for LinkedIn. What are your thoughts here about some of the hurdles which or the concerns which LinkedIn might have about SDN versus the opportunity?
So I think where we are in the market right now is the vendors are kind of playing along, but they're not necessarily jumping in with both feet. Or if they're jumping in with both feet, they're kind of doing more proprietary type things. And for hyperscalers, we're very concerned about owning our network, as most providers are. We're very concerned about owning our network in a way that allows us to control our architecture really well, which is what's interesting to us about SDN. But at this point, the tools don't seem to be in place in all the places they need to be. So we're struggling with some of those issues of trying to figure out how to get the tool set in place and what to do with this stuff so that we can actually use it.
Very cool. Thank you for that. All right, let's have another panel question. Here we're asking, the definition of SDN has changed over time, and the industry continues to redefine what it is. Some have focused primarily on the management side of the house, so that the SDN controller is really just an upscale network management system. Are we giving up on SDN by considering it as another management protocol, or are we making it smaller so that we feel more comfortable with it? Chaim, why don't you have a go at this one? What are your thoughts about the network management? I personally have found this side of the SDN discussion a little bit confusing, actually. Give us your insights here.
Yes, so basically SDN means many things to many people, and I think what happened with SDN is that after analyzing the technology, and as I said, having all of the resistance from the vendors and hesitance from the carriers, the first and foremost use case for it is just unified management, basically having next generation management, and instead of having SNMP, have Netconf and Young as SNMP on steroids. And what we see is that there is urgent problems for carriers to solve the multi-vendor solutions. They know that they cannot get good solutions from the vendors in terms of agreeing on an existing control plane to be unified and abstracted, so they go with management solutions. So it's a good use case for SDN. Basically, overlay management in the data center is the same idea of having SDN controllers just as management system and not as a reactive control systems. And what we see is that by having all of that, that means relying on management protocols that are using proprietary young models for each and every equipment. We basically, what we've done is just abstract a little bit more the solutions that we have, and even that has a lot of success. So I think the potential of SDN is still unlocked. When even a small abstraction of the network creates so many use cases, I think that when we'll have full SDN with programmatic interfaces, really vendor-agnostic solutions, and dynamic solutions, I would see much more use cases for SDN.
Very good. Adam, from Level 3, what are your thoughts about the network management component of SDN?
Absolutely. So the network, from a network management perspective, we see SDN really as a critical coexistence between the front office and back office systems, as well as each of the network technologies. So as we look back at that last poll, right, it was the coexistence of various types of technologies. And so both the enterprise and service providers have to deal with that. And SDN allows that breadth of control. So essentially we're looking at SDN as the guts of our OSS and providing that critical relationship and control function between a recast of the traditional front office, think quote, order, and other task-based services, both that an employee of a service provider might handle, or direct to an end user. But also providing that control plane into what has traditionally been delivered as a physical network functions, but is quickly becoming more available around virtual network functions or media or streaming video, or even into other cloud or partner ecosystems. This is important in that it also governs in concert with the data analytics, as well as the network, the network fabric of today, Ethernet, as it expands both the control plane of bandwidth, but also applications and functionality across an enterprise's broader IT ecosystem.
Adam, let me ask you this. I mean, most service providers that we write about at Light Reading suffer from sort of the multiplication of network management consoles. Is SDN going to be another management console that your technicians have to look at? Or is it integrated into the existing management systems? How does that work?
Yeah, it'll be integrated into the systems, and if done properly, and what we've been focusing on for really the last 5 years. So our first implementation of SDN started internally about 5 years ago. We're actually coming upon our 4-year anniversary for our external SDN implementation.
Congratulations! That's a real first move. That's a first mover position for sure.
It is. And we're excited about that, and we've seen, we have over 1,500 customers that are using it today. I could go through a host of metrics that I'll spare us here today, but it's working. And so to your question, our focus over the last 5 years, and quite frankly before that, was one of getting hands out of the network. And by getting hands out of the network, oftentimes people focus on the rapid implementation of new services. And while that is a result, one of the other results is a more accurate service provisioning and service management capability, because you don't have humans that are interacting with the service. So while people are now interfacing with an SDN controller, that controller is doing many more tasks that were previously human-based. To date, we're averaging about 10,000 tasks per month that used to be done by humans are now being done by this controller.
Wow, that's remarkable, and congratulations on that. Okay, let's move on. We're going to talk about our next panel question today, which is really targeting the service providers, our 3 service providers on the call today. Do you think that SDN today, as we're seeing it rolled out, is delivering on your expectations? And if not, what did you expect to be different? Adam, at Level 3, why don't you have a go at this one first?
Yeah, I'll say absolutely once again. We're seeing the tip of the iceberg. I believe that we have a wealth of opportunity that is before us, and in automating and better pairing the network infrastructure with our applications that we're all running as enterprises ourselves, but also as our customers' enterprises. And those use cases are expanding every single day. I've already thrown out some of the stats as far as that which is being automated today. 10,000 tasks per month. We're monitoring over 70 million data flows per month across our network. And so when you combine the power of the network with the data analytics, with the SDN control plane, you can then really start to evolve and change the way you operate your business, but also expose new capabilities to customers. So yeah, I would say it is absolutely meeting our expectations, but our expectations are much higher. We expect that we will be able to automate significantly more and expose more capabilities to our end users to put more control in their hands.
Fantastic. Jacques Tordu from Orange, first of all, welcome to the show. And secondly, I mean, we have written an awful lot at Light Reading and at Heavy Reading about Orange's deployment of NFV, less so about SDN. Tell us, how is the SDN work going with you guys over there?
Well, we tend to take the two words together. I mean, for us as a service provider, I mean, we are not going to sell SDN as such. What we are going to sell is a new generation of services, which is a combination of SDN at the core and NFV both at the core and at the edge. So to the question about are we surprised or did the initial promise meet our expectations, I think one area that was covered before is that this was supposed to be very much vendor agnostic, standards based, etc. And we know what happens to these things. I mean, early implementers try to pull the carpet below the feet of the others, etc. So the landscape from a technology and vendor standpoint has become a bit confusing, which means that for a service provider like us, we need to be very careful at what we decide to implement and what not. The other thing, of course, is that it's not a minor disruption for our industry and for communication service providers. I mean, it's an opportunity clearly to revamp a number of front office and back office systems which had become probably a bit inadequate. But it's really like changing the wheels and the engine at the same time on the car and keep driving at the same time.
Thank you, Jacques. Ross, is SDN delivering on your expectations at LinkedIn?
So at LinkedIn, we kind of see automation and SDN as two different things. And, SDN for us is more about programmable control planes in the sense of being able to shift traffic and do traffic engineering and service chaining and things like that than it is about automation. But of course, being a hyperscaler, we tend to see automation as something we're already doing. So we're not really seeing it as a big differentiator in the SDN space. From expectations perspective, I have to agree. A lot of the problem goes back to, everybody in the vendor side wants to step on this and try to make it a differentiator, which is, of course, what they do for a living. So I don't want to complain about it. It's what they do for a living. But it does make it more difficult for us to realize some of our expectations and to reach out there and actually use this stuff in a way that's effective. We're probably looking more at a programmable control plane than we are a full-out SDN, what some people might call an SDN type thing. So our expectations are probably a little bit different than other people.
I mean, I guess the world of communications technology has changed certainly since I started working in our industry. I mean, back in the 90s, if we'd had a new technology, which we did, of course, with all of the new high-speed LAN standards, we liked to standardize technologies, and we had committees which did that, and then you could test, then you could submit all new technologies based on these new standards for certification and be sure that everything was going to work together and and all of the features would be prescribed therein by the IEEE and 802 committees and things like that. That's not really how SDN is being developed now. Obviously, we have the the miraculous world of open source and crowdsourcing technology, and all of the code bases being developed, and there isn't sort of a strong hand sort of reaching down from the top and saying, okay, that's great, but this is exactly what this product must do if it's going to be considered a sort of a standard solution. Do you think there's a disadvantage to not having the type of hierarchical standards that we used to define technologies back in the 1990s, and the fact that we haven't got an equivalent for SDN today? Russ, what are your thoughts on that?
I actually think there are some standards bodies working in this space. The IETF is an I2RS working group, and there are some other people, the open people working on OpenFlow. The real question is how much does the community pay attention to those standards, and do those standards actually fit what every provider wants to do? And the answer is probably everybody has a different idea of what they're doing with the SDN storyline. So therefore, we are thinking about things in different ways, so we're using different things. And of course, or different components of this. And of course, open source does have a huge impact there, where it's positive and it's also negative, right? We have positive things with the open source movement and negative things with the open source movement in this space. So I think it is a little bit different. And of course, coming from the IP world, we've never really had the strong hand that telecoms had so much. So it's not as unfamiliar territory for the IP folk, but it is nonetheless more fragmented than it has been in the past.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's quite confusing as well. Chaim, is it difficult for ECI to develop SDN solutions in this type of market where you have to contend with all of the influences of open source, all of the different committees and groups and organizations working around virtualization technology? Does that make it challenging?
I think for us it's an opportunity. We embrace open source open-heartedly because for us, open source really is about dealing with only innovation and not about infrastructure. I think for every vendor that tries to have its own infrastructure, it's basically playing a losing game. So by having an SDN controller which is standardized and open source, it really helps us to focus on applications and innovations, less on trying to differentiate ourselves on a specific infrastructure. And I think the best thing that happened from open source with regards to standardization is that for many years standardization had been developed without regard to how it's going to be implemented. There were good reasons for that, because basically standardization was for hardware, and it's very difficult to do iterations on hardware. So the hardware was developed and then standardization. And if something was really bad, then they reiterated the standards again. With code and open source projects, what you can have is direct feedback to the standardization. So we are pushing the way of pushing standards from codes. This is the work we are doing now with ONOS as an SDN controller, enables us to try new ideas, to show that they are valuable, and only then go to the standardization bodies. So I think the world of open source combined with the standardization bodies is a much more agile one that enables fast innovation.
Interesting. Thank you. By the way, just our audience is submitting some absolutely fantastic questions here. Do keep those coming using the console on your screens right now. We'll get to those at the end of this event. But in the meantime, we're going to take our next panel question, which again is primarily directed to the service providers on our event today. What technical challenges are you seeing when trying to roll out SDN? Adam, again, level 3, is there a specific technical area which is particularly problematic for you and that you're focusing on right now at level 3 when deploying SDN?
Yeah, I would say the technical challenges are the hybrid nature of the networks that the service provider has deployed, and that includes not only the technology at each point in the network, but the access types, the mediums over which the services have to be deployed. But that second part of the question is probably what's most intriguing, right? While the technical implementation has been a challenge that we've been working through over the past years, It's really the human side of change, the process change that has really opened up new opportunities and has been probably the biggest challenge that we've faced, right? How do all these things come together? What are the critical pieces of the puzzle that tie all of the elements together? And so what we've seen is not only a shift in the technology or the technical piece of it, but how people do their job, the process by which they do it, and it's a shift in personnel. You mentioned a moment ago about the business case, and all too often, automation associated with SDN, not that SDN is automation, but it's a piece of it, people automatically assume that can replace people. That it's a replacement of jobs, and we're actually seeing it a little bit different. We're seeing it as a shift in resources to focus more on exception basis versus the actual task-oriented architecture that was driven earlier on in the service provider era. So that shift allows you to be more consultative with your customers and talk about the new use cases of how the network and how the IT resources are coming together and have to interact as one.
Very interesting. Jacques at Orange, what technical challenges are you facing with SDN, or is it, as Adam at Level 3 was saying, more an issue of process than technology in terms of making getting the most advantage out of SDN technology?
Well, it's not really technology. You're right. It's more what we do with it and how we assemble technology. Our job is changing. I mean, historically we were assembling pipes and core network equipment and CPEs. I mean, and all of our engineering power was having these skills, and now it's a very different game. I mean, still assembling a number of bricks of technology, but a lot more software, and therefore that it puts a strain on our resources to really cope with all the innovation coming from different vendors, test them, etc., etc. So technically, that's really where the challenge is. I mean, it takes a lot of engineering resources to really keep pace with what's happening and making the right selection for our future roadmap.
Well, that sounds like you need more people. Isn't one of the points of, certainly in the engineering department, but isn't one of the end goals of SDN to end up with less staff? Is that part of the long-term business strategy to use virtualization to reduce the number of technical staff that you have internally at Orange?
Well, in operations for sure, maybe not necessarily in engineering. And engineering will become another IT, essentially. So I'm talking more on the qualitative level. I mean, skills will have to change, and we have to find ways. Let's take an example. I mean, by having far more software and third-party software, whether open source or not, in our products, we will have to issue new versions, new releases on a quarterly or even monthly basis, which was not something that the traditional telco was used to do. I mean, you could put technology and not touch it for a couple of years. That's no longer going to be possible. We'll have to be following the pace of those people who are developing all of these nice virtualized functions, and that's also a paradigm shift for us.
Very, very interesting. Thank you for that, Jacques. Russ, at LinkedIn, technical challenges that you're overcoming here, or do you want to talk to us about how deploying SDN has prompted LinkedIn to have to change its internal processes?
Yeah, so technical challenges go back to having the equipment and the tool sets and things like that to actually make some of this stuff work the way we want it to. Changes to what we're doing, yes, it's going to have, over time, it already had made some changes in our operational stance and what we're doing from a business perspective, or I would say architecture, the interaction between the business and the technology. I would say that's going to grow over time as we grow into more things. We're standing up a new data center that's going to be much more reliant on programmable network interfaces and what you might call SDN, depending on your perspective of things. And so as we see those things roll out and we understand better how and where to use them, I think we're going to see a lot more changes in that area.
Very interesting. You know, we are getting some really great questions coming in from the audience. And Russ, I think I'm going to ask you one of these right now, which was, how is the deployment of SDN being influenced by other initiatives such as NFV and OpenStack and Open Compute? What are your thoughts on that, Russ?
So very interesting question. I think that they are tangential, they're interrelated, they are kind of codependent on each other in some ways, or you could say that, for instance, if you were going to deploy NFV, it's potentially possible to deploy NFV without something like SDN in your network or anything like that, but it's a lot simpler, a lot easier, and you can do a lot more with it if you actually have an SDN underlay that you're using rather than just straight IP or something like a standard MPLS traffic engineered network. So there are some enablement pieces here, and there are some interaction pieces, particularly in orchestration and in traffic engineering and stuff that are going on. But they're not necessarily the same thing. They aren't necessarily directly related in the way that people might think when you first look at them. It's more of a layering interactive type thing than it is. It's kind of hard to explain, but that's kind of where I would see it.
No, I think you've explained it well. Chaim from ECI, do you agree that these are interdependent technologies?
Yes, I agree with Russ that while you can deploy each and every one of them independent from each other, they are really very interdependent. For NFV to work properly, you need to be able to offload the data path from the VM or container that you are using, and the only way to do that efficiently is to use SDN. And things like OpenStack had been SDN. They have the networking part like Quantum, which was SDN from beginning, and using more sophisticated SDN schemes can make it much more scalable than it is today. So yes, these technologies influence each other, and I think NFV and OpenStack are very much related to each other. And I think Open Compute, by enabling to have really white boxes that you can do whatever you do with them, whatever you want with them, is another technology that will enable SDN to be more popular, just because you will be able to deploy your own OpenFlow and and SDN solutions based on white boxes and not be dependent on releases by vendors.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Chaim. Let's go back and tackle our next panel question, which actually in some ways is perhaps for many among our audience the number one concern right now, which is what happens to the legacy equipment when you move to SDN? How will enterprises and service providers in particular be impacted by this transformation? It's really a key issue. What do they have to change? What do they have to implement? And is there a cost associated with that? Chaim, let's stay with you here. Chaim from ECI. What are your thoughts about what happens when you move to SDN to the legacy equipment?
So at this juncture, we don't see any big impact of SDN deployment on legacy equipment, just because SDN today is just, as I said, the management on steroids. So it's basically managing the same equipment using standard interfaces or more standard interfaces built upon existing management systems. So at this time, we don't see much change. In the future, what we'll see is more and more change for programmatic hardware, mostly in greenfield networks, and then we're going to see a big change. I would like to remind the audience that it's not the first time, and it's not going to be the last time, that the telecom providers would need to make forklift upgrades. 15 years ago, they started to do migration from SDH to IP. It was forklifting of everything. And the only reason they went there is just because they knew there is value in the new technology. So they were willing to accept the cost because the cost was compensated by big profit in the network. I think when carriers see the benefits of SDN and OpenFlow and other technologies, they would do the forklifting required. And I can tell you from things I'm talking about with customers that they are telling me the same story that happened with the IP. It required new people, new skill sets, things that I haven't had in the past. And it took them a lot of time to deploy all of these new services. And I think the time it took them to deploy IP is what what makes them more hesitant today to deploy more new technologies, because most of them have just finished to get the IP and MPLS networks matured and running. So when they see the benefit, they will do the changes that they need to do.
Okay, very good. Do you agree with that, Jacques? Jacques Taudieu from Orange, do you agree that there's going to be some big shifts which are going to happen when service providers see the benefits?
Well, I think the answer is twofold, depending if you take the point of view of the end customer or that of the provider. I mean, clearly the provider, I mean, we have to make investments in our networks and to a large extent, it's as was said before, it's something we have to do anyway, because every once in a while you need to upgrade the technology in your at the core of your network. Then the customer perspective is very different, and this perspective varies very much across different types of customers. Typically, especially in North America, we see customers who are very much interested in co-managing or self-managing their networks, whereas in Europe and maybe also in Asia, people buy a managed service, and they don't really care whether it's SDN inside or OpenStack or whatever. They buy a managed service on a long-term contract, and what they want is value for money, basically. And many of them tell us, I don't really want to know all of these things about the technology. So we'll have to adjust to that as well, because again, we are willing to take some of the financial risks of the investment in new technologies, but seen from the customer perspective, the value and what might be new in terms of value in this new way of networking is very much about the virtualized functions. And then the charging mechanism for these functions, how they will be licensed, what will be open source, what not, etc. This will create also a difference between those customers who want to be masters of their own destiny and decide bit by bit what they buy, what they don't buy, and those who just want to buy a managed service and will leave the decision on CapEx and sourcing to their provider.
Very good. Thank you. Let's take our next question, which I think is a fantastically important one. What about the human side of the change and implementation of SDN? Adam, at level 3, do you have to identify new staff altogether to run your SDN programmable network, or are you retraining your existing staff as AT&T is trying to do? What's happening at level 3 with the human component of this, and is there a sort of cultural shift which needs to take place within level 3 as well? I mean, you're probably well along the path to that right now, aren't you?
We are, and yes, there is a cultural shift that has had to and has to take place. As we think about the human side of change, it's really around two areas. It's the preparation and deployment of these new capabilities and what they bring to the organization. So what we've done is centered around, from a preparation standpoint, from an organizational structure standpoint, is that matters. It requires strict alignment of across the organization, from the CTO, the CIO, the CMO, and the operations teams. And so we've brought those teams together to share the goals of its deployment and what it means to our business. We must act and work as one team. From an engagement standpoint, you go back to yesteryear and you had the magic IT curtain, as we call it, where the business owner or business person would define a need and slide it under the magic IT curtain. It would get done, and something would be yielded that may or may not hit the mark. We don't have a magic curtain. We require the business owner to be working strictly with the CIO organization to ensure that what is being developed along the way is actually being delivered and meets that business need. Then and only then can you integrate the process end to end, which leads to the human change, right? How the humans interact with the systems and how they facilitate even up to and including a machine-to-machine interaction, which is the ultimate goal, so that you can provide the applications interacting directly with the network when and where necessary. Then and only then can you start to externalize it in a deployment fashion and look towards automation or optimize your organizational structure to be more exception handling, as I spoke about earlier, versus task oriented. And that as you start to externalize it and present it to your users, it's the same information that is being used by the end user that is also being used by your operations team. So there's not a disconnect of information. And that then drives consistency. And that's, quite frankly, that's a little bit different because you have such a tightly integrated construct, and that control plane drives a direct interaction. So when something is requested, it's actually being delivered as it's being requested versus having humans go in there and actually do something.
Wow, I mean, you've obviously been on quite a journey with this. I mean, this is not, you're not talking about this in a sort of in a theoretical way at all, are you? It sounds like there's been quite a lot of work done there in terms of the human component of SDN. Within level 3. Do you feel there's a long way further to go still, or are you satisfied that you're pretty much in the right place in terms of the human resourcing which has to take place to support SDN?
Yeah, I operate on a principle of never be complacent. There's always opportunity to improve. So the journey must continue as we look at end users and the coming together of both the IT and the network function. Our employees must do the same, and they must learn how the applications are being run within the enterprise and what's important to the enterprise around performance and access to information, whether it's a BCDR application, whether it's a spin up of a new or launch of a new program or application or video service. Each of those require different data analytics, and it's those data analytics that will both inform and evolve the organization and our customers in the industry. And so we must continue to evolve with that.
Very cool. Really, really interesting insights, Adam. Thank you for sharing that. Jim Metzler, what are your thoughts about the human component of moving to SDN?
Well, Steve, I think that's an incredibly important question, as you said. And often when I'm working with a client, we talk about implementing a new technology, a new service, a technology transition. I'll point out that this journey is about three things: technology, people, and process. And Steve, sometimes I'll do a little joke, and I say, tell you what, customer, I'll do the technology part, and you do the people and process part. And that's a joke because typically the technology part is far easier. And when I think about the people part, I want to break it down to two components: organizational skills and culture. And a previous speaker before Adam talked about how the skills have to change. And I think Adam did a tremendous job of talking about how that's happening inside of his company. And by the way, in my mind, changing the skills is one part of the responsibility of the company and one part of the employee. But, Steve, you mentioned AT&T. Now, just from a distance, I've heard what they're saying about how they're trying to change their skill base around. I have to admit I have some concerns. You hear them say they want to become a software company. Okay, that's fine. And there's a lot of discussion now that have told people go out and get training on software, go out and get training on analytics. And I used to one time I worked for AT&T, and I was an application developer. Just going out and getting some training on software, if you don't use it soon, kind of goes away. And so I'm kind of more attracted to what Adam was saying. And I'm embellishing it a bit, let's try to determine what the jobs are going to be in the near-term future, and maybe the distant future, and combine formal training with on-the-job training. Just sitting in class for a couple of weeks is nice, but it's not the same thing. So I think that, again, the employee and the company has a real role there in terms of evolving skills. But let's switch over to culture, which is, in my mind, a little bit bigger and certainly has a major impact if you want to talk about how CSPs can roll out new services, fundamentally new services, quicker. And the reason culture is so important is, if someone's been working for a company 5, 10, 15 years, Steve, and been rewarded or punished for certain types of behavior, that doesn't change overnight. And I remember being an engineering manager for then 9X. We would take years to roll out a new service to make sure it was perfect, because no matter what happened, we had to look back and convince people it was perfect. So I think part of the cultural change here, people really want to be able to leverage these technologies, not to spin up this or that faster, but to roll out new services faster. They have to work on changing the culture. And I've talked to a number of CSPs who will agree with that, say, yeah, the toughest problem we have going from a POC to production is changing the culture, both within our company and of some of our suppliers, such OSS, BSS vendors, who tend to move slowly in predictable ways also. But if we don't address that problem, gee, the technology can be very nimble, but rolling out new services, not much different.
Very interesting. I mean, really helpful insights from our panel today, and fantastic questions coming from our audience here. Hopefully, we're going to get to quite a few of those during this event. We may run a couple of minutes long just to do that, but I also want to assure our audience members that if you've asked a question and we don't get to it during today's event, our sponsor and Light Reading will come back to you with some answers post the event as well. So let's move on to the next panel question. And there's always two sides to a new technology. How does it help you save money, and how does it help you make money? And this question is really focused on the second side of that equation. When it comes to the ease of realizing new revenue from SDN, what services will offer the most immediate revenue potential? That is an absolutely critical question, isn't it? Jim, let's stay with you. What's your high-level thoughts on revenue potential from SDN services?
Well, Steve, I want to go back again to when I was an engineering manager for 9X, and we would take a couple of years to roll out a new service because they're on these purpose-built type appliances that if the service didn't work, we had to throw them away, and that was not good for anybody's career. I also want to agree with the previous speaker that talked about kind of the blurring of SDN and NFV. You take those two together, something that really excites me is the whole virtual CPE, where communication service providers can leverage an asset they have that the over-the-top players don't have, and that's real estate, and be able to, I'll just embellish this a bit, have kind of generic servers in their COs, download software on a pay-as-you-go, pay-as-you-grow basis, offer a new service, and if it takes off, it's relatively easy to expand it. If it doesn't, there's not a whole lot of investment from a CapEx or an OpEx perspective. Now, I'm diminishing a bit the difficulty of integration, et cetera, but it certainly is a much more nimble way for service providers to offer some new services and, again, leverage their very valuable real estate.
Very cool. You know what? We're gonna keep moving here. Actually, well, no. Let's talk to Adam at level 3 first of all before we do that. What do you see as the immediate opportunity in terms of revenue potential from SDN?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be brief.
No problem.
I agree that there's the on-demand services. I'll talk briefly about a shift that we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months. It's around the over-the-top dynamic bandwidth services. And so what previously had been thought of, I'm going to just test it out and run these events in my off-peak hours, we're seeing a shift to a comfort with dynamic services and using them during business hours, and that is the dialing up or dialing down of services for true over-the-top bandwidth needs. Historically, the enterprise has had relatively static bandwidth requirements for their day-to-day operations. There may be seasonal needs or time-of-day needs. However, it's pretty static. And what we're seeing, though, with the on-demand need for access to critical applications, whether they're stored in a private data center, a public data center, or have assets in both, they're dialing those events up. They're dialing our capacity up during those peak hours so that they can access them immediately. They don't have to wait till midnight to 4 a.m. or the weekends for those events to take shape. And what that translates to is increased revenue opportunities for the service provider, but also efficient utilization of their bandwidth for the enterprise. So it's a win-win on both accounts. That coupled with the pull-through revenue for the underlying network services, because it provides more capabilities for customers to interact not with the service provider but with their applications.
Very good. Jacques told you from Orange, there's one particular WAN service, SD-WAN, which we're hearing a lot about at Live Reading these days. Let me ask you specifically about that one. Is that something that Orange views as an opportunity to generate immediate revenue?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. I mean, it all depends what you call SD-WAN, because there are probably as many definitions as players in the industry. As somebody said earlier, it's one of the use cases which actually you could have implemented without a full-blown SDN technology before, and you had the early implementations of it, which is mostly about path selection, offload to the internet from an MPLS primary path, etc., etc. So this use case is very important for our customers because, for obvious reasons, long-distance transport on MPLS is still expensive. The internet is good, but not as good as it should be, and therefore people want to have that kind of capability. You could render that service with bespoke boxes, etc. And the buzz and noise created by a number of pure SD-WAN over-the-top agile players has certainly contributed to confusing the minds of our customers, because for most of them, if you would ask them what's the difference between SDN and SD-WAN, they would say, well, it's the same. And therefore, we have to go beyond that little hurdle, I would say, in the development of the technologies. And some of the players who are making a lot of noise today are probably there to be acquired or merge with others, etc. So it's typical of these disruptive moments where the long-term promise is understood by everybody. Some people come with an early implementer solution, and then people confuse the end goal with one use case, as was said. So clearly it is important to be able to work on the SD-WAN kind of use case, but it's only a portion of the full SDN story and promise.
Fantastic. Let's go to our final panel question today, which is question 10. What should vendors be doing to help the CSP customer, the carrier customer, service provider customer, take the next step into SDN? Adam, at level 3, what are your thoughts about what companies like ECI can do to help you move forward with SDN at this point?
Yeah, I would look at this as we don't look at any one participant in the SDN ecosystem as a vendor anymore, right? We're looking at it as a partnership, and so participation in such forums like Metro Ethernet Forum has their LSO initiative, and there are others across the industry. It's ensuring that we're not all just participating. We're leading in that and having the active discussions about how the interoperability of all of these resources, partners including technology partners, systems ecosystem partners, controller partners. I know Cisco's gotten active over the last year with their acquisition of TLF, and it's important that these folks play together, and we all are one solving for an overarching IT network hybrid ecosystem.
Thank you. Jacques Tardieu from Orange. What should the vendors be doing to help service providers with SDN at this point?
Well, I mean, there is a wide range of vendors. I mean, and for us, what is important is to decide with whom we are going to continue to play ball, because we cannot play ball with everyone. Given, as I said before, the level of investment required in testing and assembling all of these technologies, we need to be relatively selective. So, of course, the history of past relationship plays a role there, but it's also the willingness of vendors to understand the point of view of the service provider and not just that their piece of software is great. And it's those vendors who are able to put ourselves in our shoes that we probably have the most productive conversations. Because otherwise it's just another piece of technology that in isolation doesn't do any good to anyone.
Right. Russ White from LinkedIn, do you think the vendors are doing a good job of working together to develop SDN and move it forward? Is there more that you would like them to be doing?
Always.
Oh, I think we've lost you, Russ. You might have to...
Yeah, it's about, it seems to me that where we are with vendors right now is that what we mostly want them to do is to support the open standards that are out there, or the standards that are out there, and as much of the open interfaces and programmatic interfaces as possible. This is kind of where we're struggling. You know, it's okay to have CLIs, but CLIs are kind of moving. We need to move out of the CLI realm in the networking world. We need to get to the post-CLI world. We've gotten to the post-CLI world in computers and phones and all these other places, but we haven't gotten past the CLI and the networking world, and we need to figure out how to do this, and we need to figure out how to allow people to actually manage their control plane and to actually inject policy and separate their policy from their reachability and other stuff in their network in a way that makes sense. So that's kind of where we need to be, I think.
Well, that is an interesting segue. We're in the Q&A section now. I just want to tackle a couple of these questions because there have been some good ones from some pretty big service providers on this event. And one of the questions here was around standardization. You know, where are we with standardization of SDN? Because it isn't, a conventional sort of standards environment that somebody like myself, who has been covering communication standards since sort of 1989, is familiar with. You know, the standards per se from the open source community aren't really what most of us in the telecom community would consider standards. They're more like the pirate's code, just sort of like a set of guidelines, really. Do we need to have a stronger set of standards or a different type of standards authority or infrastructure to cover SDN? Chaim, what's your opinion as a vendor who's on the sharp end of implementing all of this technology about standardization with SDN right now?
So I think, as I mentioned before, that there should be a coupling between standardization and implementation. So in the past it was only standardization, and now we've turned to the other side where it is only implementation, like in OpenStack. And I think neither extremes is good enough for the environment, especially for the telecom environment. I think by having the right mixture of standardization and code, which are working hand in hand, that would be much better for the ecosystem of the SDN, because things like implementation, and I've heard stories about why OpenFlow doesn't succeed, because it doesn't work. And why is it that people say that OpenFlow doesn't work? Because it was only papers and documents, but there was no reference implementation. So when you suggested something, but it was not implemented, people could come to you and say, you know what, doesn't work, doesn't interoperate. So this on one side, you need all of this open source communities, so it's not dominated by one specific vendor. On the other hand, you need the standardization, otherwise you have a fragmented market with everyone having their own implementation, and you can see how many Linux distributions there are. So the right mixture between standardization and code working together, I think, is the way to go.
Thank you. Here's another specific question for you, Russ. Russ White. What's from one of our audience members, service providers? What's the difference between a programmable control plane and SDN? Do you want to have a go at that, Russ?
Sure. So, in my view, a programmable control plane is more about how you manage policy and the business interaction with the network. And SDN is more about a set of technologies and a way of doing business in terms of centralizing things. So to me, SDN tends to be more about taking the control plane off the individual devices or reducing the responsibility in that area. And programmable network is more of a hybrid mode where you allow the control plane to do what it does, but then you overlay it with policy mechanisms that allow you to inject business into the network without actually taking everything out of the network. So it's kind of a in-between state.
Cool. I'm going to leave our last question, which I'm going to take today, is about concerns over security with SDN. Jacques Tardieu from Orange, is security something which is a concern specifically as it relates to deploying SDN? Does SDN introduce any security concerns in your network that Orange is concerned about or has to engineer around?
Well, I think here, like for other aspects of this technology, it's really the move from hardware to software which changes a little bit the rules of the game. I mean, security was important before, it will be important with SDN, but the way where you have to monitor, where you have to implement, and I mean, the software is probably more vulnerable than hardware, which is in a central office where you have physical security and then no remote access of any kind, etc. Now, everything being software, everything being open, you have new challenges in security, but I mean, it's not specific to SDN. It's true of anything in our global digital world, basically. So we take security more seriously than ever, of course. We have to also adjust the skills and move our mindset to maybe different ways of doing things, but it remains at the top of the agenda, clearly.
Of course. We're out of time here. In fact, we ran a little bit long today. I have to say I'm a fan of this particular format of webinar where we have a discussion rather than presentations, because I think it gives everybody an opportunity to contribute some really interesting analysis in a very engaging way. I think our panelists have done a fantastic job today, so thank you to all of them, to Russ from LinkedIn, Jim from Metzler & Associates, Jacques from Orange, Adam from Level 3, and of course, I'm CTO of ECI, which is the sponsor of this event and our partner in producing it. You guys did a really, really great job today, and so did you, our audience, with the polls and also the questions you submitted. If we didn't get to your question, we'll respond after the event. There's a survey up on your screen right now. We'd really like you to take that survey if you can, because it gives us the opportunity to do a better job with these events in the future. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to all of our panelists. Great job, guys, and we'll see you for the next light reading webinar. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.